A ver, ahorita pido que me ayuden. Bueno, pues hemos llegado a la última sesión de nuestro foro de este día, una sesión que hemos estado esperando con muchas ganas sobre México y Estados Unidos hacia el Pacífico y las nuevas oportunidades y reglas que esto presenta, con tres personas de lujo en el panel. El secretario Ildefonso Guajardo, que en la mañana, secretario, le dimos las gracias por ser nuestra institución aliada y quedamos de darle las gracias cuando llegase usted. Muchas gracias por el apoyo para la realización de este foro. Está con nosotros el representante de Comercio de Estados Unidos, el embajador Michael Froman. Welcome to Mexico, Mr. Froman. Y la sesión va a ser moderada por el doctor Herminio Blanco, presidente de ICOM y asociado de Comexi también. En esta sesión vamos a tener oportunidad, unos minutos al final, de preguntas y respuestas, pero les pedimos por favor que las hagan por escrito. El staff del Consejo va a pasar a recoger las preguntas y se las pueden dar. ¿Pueden levantar las manos, Eli? Le pueden dar las tarjetas a las personas que están levantando las manos para pasar las preguntas al final, por favor. Y bueno, sin más, llegamos al panel que estamos esperando. Gracias.
Pues muy buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Yo creo que todos nosotros estamos convencidos de lo interesante que han estado todas las presentaciones, pero sin lugar a dudas, como en cualquier buena familia, el principal platillo se queda al final. Lo único que voy a decir en español, now is English, sorry. You can now take it off.
Just in case.
Just going to take it off. Well, I would like to start by recognizing very, very especially the fact that you are here. I don't know if everybody in this room realizes that this is a big statement of the commitment of President Obama and yours personally, for TPP, to come to Mexico during a presidential campaign in the United States in which free trade, Mexico and TPP have been almost a piñata or more than that. So we recognize you and we thank you for being here, truly. So that's the only thing nice I'm going to do.
That's the warm-up.
As a warm-up. This has certainly been a very long negotiating process, a difficult one. And I would like to start by asking the latecomer, Minister Guajardo, one, about the implications of being late. Two, about just a basic question that I'm sure many Mexicans ask. Wasn't NAFTA working well after 22 years, and now you want to negotiate and renegotiate or do whatever?
Well,
and finally,
it's not over.
It's a big question. And finally, when you negotiate TPP, wouldn't NAFTA lose relevance? And more important, wouldn't North America lose relevance?
Let me, first of all, thank Mike Froman for being here. I kind of miss you after 3 years of seeing you every 2 months. But kind. Let me take it from the very beginning. Here in the front line are the leading business coalition that has been following the international or world trade negotiations of Mexico. The president of the Consejo Empresarial Mexicano. Thank you, Juan Pablo Castañón, for being here. But also, he represents the umbrella organization in the private sector that follows the Cuarto de Junto, that integrates the Cuarto de Junto. Moisés Kalish has been designated by them. Juan Gallardo used to play that role during NAFTA. And let me tell you that at the beginning it was not easy to convince the Mexican private sector to really jump on TPP. And I shared that with Mike, because every time that Mike was trying to convince me to include labor and environmental issues within the agreement, my private sector was not highly convinced of doing that change. And after long deliberations, I really think that they understood why Mexico could not afford to be out of TPP. First of all, the market share in the North American market will have been challenged by new Asian competitors. If we were not within the agreement, the pen to write the agreement was going to be controlled by somebody else. And the fact that Mexico jumped in together with Canada gave us the possibility to draft each one of those charters. And La Senadora Vianey made a remark about the implications of being late. Yes, Mexico and Canada, and later Japan, were the latest members to join. But let me tell you that one of the good things is that when we joined, basically 29 or 30 charters were in a very, very early development. Only SMEs was the only charter that was basically closed. And that charter is very positive for everybody. There was nothing to negotiate anything to negotiate in that charter. But then the other 29 charters were in the drawing board. And that gave us the chance to be part of the negotiation effort from the very beginning. So at the end of the day, basically 29 charters out of 30 had Mexico's imprint in the negotiation process. So that helped us a lot in that context. Now, NAFTA. What I was discussing with the business community in Mexico, the first recommendation they gave me is, tell Froman that we want a NAFTA carve-out for labor and environment. We like it is in NAFTA, and do not include those two charters subject to retaliation on trade retaliation issues in TPP. I told Mike that, and he just smiled and said, nope, cannot do. Because after 20 years of going to the US Congress with new agreements, all the agreements that the US had negotiated included the labor and environmental charter. But when you analyze it from the point of view of national interest, it is in our national interest to strengthen the observance of our own labor laws and our own environmental laws. Why? Because with agreement or without agreement, any weakness in the agricultural sector for exports to the North American market are at risk, not because of the treaty, just because of public opinion. And therefore, it's in our best interest that our own labor laws are enforced across sectors, regardless of those elements. So I want tomato producers to have schools for kids of migrant workers in Sinaloa, in Jalisco, and I want kids to be observed not to handle chemicals in the fields because that's a dangerous job for children. So at the end of the day, as a Mexican, I feel extremely proud that I can include in those processes reinforcement of obedience of our labor rights and our environmental rights. So at the end of the day, it's not about Mike's recommendation. It's about the way we think as Mexicans for the future of the country. Now, coexistence. And Mike remembers it was a nightmare for him because we were all the time making a case for a specific paragraph that reads exactly that NAFTA will coexist with TPP. Obviously, if you are an exporter or an investor within the North American territory, you can select under which rules you are going to trade. Now, when there are new elements that did not exist in NAFTA, or new elements in a subject or matter in the new agreement, obviously the new agreement prevails over the old agreement. So coexistence means that you can choose one or the other when the terms of reference are equivalent, but when there is modernity introduced in the new agreement, that prevails over the old agreement. So at the end of the day, I think that the business sector basically endorsed it very strongly when it was understood clearly to preserve our market share in North America, to open up to Asia that we have been disregarded as trade policy for many years, and to deepen our agreement with Japan that was very superficial in the agroalimentary fields.
Very good. Well, I would add to the labor and environment, one of the reasons what that is important for us also is because there are countries such as Vietnam there, maybe Indonesia.
It's also an offensive interest.
Right. This is the first time we have offensive interest on labor and environment.
You're right.
With Vietnam, maybe Indonesia in the future, and hopefully one of these.
Or even Malaysia.
One of these years, Malaysia, and maybe even China. And for you, you have been leading not only this negotiation, but also you've been leading the negotiation with Europe. Two of the most important negotiations. And you also are sort of a latecomer to TPP, since I don't know if the ambassador is here or is not, but there was a group that started with a minor game, and you came in and you made it a big game. So for me, it's sort of interesting for you to tell us why do you choose to do those two negotiations when we had at the time something that didn't seem as dead as it is right now, which is the Doha round. One of my speeches was, if we don't do the Doha round, the U.S. is going to do these agreements, and WTO is going to become basically a dispute settlement mechanism. What can you tell us about this?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, and it's always good to see my friend Ildefonso Guajardo. You can see he has been not only a great defender and promoter of Mexico's interests at the negotiating table, but also one of the ministers that played the strongest leadership roles beyond national interest to bring TPP to a close. So I'm eternally grateful to him. You should all be very grateful to him as well for delivering such a strong agreement for Mexico and for the global trading system. And I see members of his distinguished negotiating team here in the audience as well, and they deserve a great deal of recognition as well. You know, I think, Maria, to answer your question, we all believe that multilateral trade liberalization is the highest and best form of trade liberalization, and we all are strong supporters of the WTO system, not just as a dispute settlement mechanism, but as a forum for trade liberalization. But the Doha negotiations have become stalemated, frankly, in our view, because major emerging economies like China, India, Brazil, and others were unwilling to take on responsibilities commensurate with their role in the global economy. And when you have a trade negotiation where fundamentally developed countries have a certain set of obligations and major emerging economies that are very competitive in any number of areas have none or very much lower responsibilities, that's not a recipe for success in this day and age. Now, I think through TPP, through TTIP, we have been working to try and demonstrate that trade liberalization can continue to make progress and that we can make progress in setting high standard rules of the road, whether it's on state-owned enterprises or the free and open internet, the free flow of data, on intellectual property rights, on strong and enforceable labor and environmental obligations. Those are all things that we successfully negotiated in TPP, that we're working on in TTIP with the European Union, and that we hope together, when you have those two agreements together, that's about 2/3 of the global economy. It will make it that much easier to multilateralize those kinds of results when the time is right in the multilateral system. What has happened, though, at the WTO, I think is quite interesting. Over the last couple of years, rather than having ministerial meetings where everybody repeats the same stale talking points of we must get Doha done this year, there's been a real discussion with both developed, emerging, and developing countries about how we need to have new ways of dealing with old issues, and we need to create openness to dealing with new issues, whether it's e-commerce or fish subsidies or small and medium-sized enterprises or other issues. And there's more dynamism going on right now around the WTO of thinking through how to form an agenda going forward than I think we've seen in quite some time, and we're quite optimistic about where it might head.
Good. I'm going to ask Minister Guajardo again a question that he didn't answer, but that question will also be for you. You know, we have had NAFTA through 22 years. We have built a very competitive region. Wouldn't TPP just make North American irrelevant?
No, I think I did answer in an indirect way, maybe not the way you expected.
Very indirect.
But let me put it in this way. Mexico, since the time that you were chief negotiator of NAFTA, did a great deal negotiating NAFTA. And then we went on to devise a very interesting system of international trade. We integrated with Latin America. We strengthened with Alianza Pacífico our ties to modern countries that represents half of foreign investment going to the region, half of the trade happening in the region. But then, during your time, we also did Europe. We did Europe in an agreement that is quite outdated and has to be updated. And so it was very clear that Mexico has been very strong in links to the north, to the south, to the east. But our policies to the fastest growing regions in the world were really not evolving. And so Japan became a very important player. It was not enough. So we have to relaunch our relationship with China in a bilateral basis, and we have to devise how to link to the Pacific region. Now, TPP was going to happen with us or without us. I think that TPP strengthens, in the way it is negotiated, the value chains that are being built in North America. It gives us presence and competitiveness vis-a-vis other regions in the world. Today, the second largest partner of the US basically is China, isn't it? or the third largest partner. It's the second largest partner.
No, it's
No, but for imports to the U.S.
for imports.
Imports is
Yes,
the second
that's probably
supplier. For Mexico, it's our second largest trading partner. So China is taking a place with or without treaties in our regions. And the whole context of Asia has to be developed in a way in which we have to do an architecture of trade to really improve in our global links and how to compete with Asia. So giving our back to a continent that has been evolving quite fast would not have been the right answer. And if you look at the numbers up to the last year, Mexico with NAFTA was losing market share in the US market. Fortunately, for the last statistics, we went up 1% of market share in the US imports. But so far, we started losing grounds without treaties with Asia. So the way let's regulate and construct how we want to tie with that region in the world.
Very good. Ambassador.
Look, I think from our perspective, NAFTA was negotiated in the early 1990s, and as you know, it's no secret, it is hotly debated in the United States. When Senator Obama was running for president, he made clear that he felt it was important to upgrade or modernize NAFTA. And he was very specific about what he meant. He talked about labor and environmental issues, he talked about a few other issues, and that's exactly what we did through TPP when Mexico and Canada joined, is work together, one, to strengthen the rules-based system itself, which we take for granted, but at a time when there are alternative models being put out there that are not rules-based, that are more statist, mercantilist, where big countries throw their weight around, where small countries may not feel like they have the same ability to use dispute settlement to resolve disputes. It's important to reinforce the rules-based trading system. And where those rules are reflecting modern, high-standard rules across a whole array of issues. You take something like the internet and digital economy and e-commerce, which of course didn't exist in 1992 when NAFTA was done. Now it's a major part of all of our economies. Not just internet companies, but small and medium-sized businesses engage in international trade largely through e-commerce. And when somebody sells something from a town here in Mexico, halfway across the world, they're using telecom services, software services, electronic payment services, express delivery services. Those are all issues dealt with in TPP. When people talk about the Internet of Things and how data is such a part not only of internet companies, but of all manufacturing companies now, making sure we get the rules right, that the ecosystem is one that helps promote innovation and that we're at the leading edge of that is absolutely critical, and that's what TPP has allowed us to do, as well as Ildefonso said, open up markets, some of the fastest growing and largest markets in the world, to our exports. The US and Mexico, we are already quite open economies, but a lot of these economies, I think there's 6 TPP countries with whom Mexico did not have an FTA before. And of course you had one with Japan, but as you mentioned, it could use some upgrading as well. TPP allows that opportunity to tear down barriers to those markets for exports coming from North America, and we face much higher barriers in those countries than we provide to them.
Thank you. Let me ask you a little bit about what were sort of the roughest, hardest topics during the negotiation. I'm sure for you, Secretary Guajardo, you had many. Whatever you want to tell us about your bilateral problems during the negotiation is welcome, but let me be a little bit more neutral. Really, one of the countries in which you spend, I think, Secretary Guajardo, a lot of time and interest and from the private sector is precisely Vietnam. And I do believe that speaking about the threat that Vietnam represents for us, the type of disciplines that we now have in a chapter that before we will be very afraid to negotiate, which is the chapter on state-owned enterprises. How is that a big help for us in dealing countries like Vietnam and maybe in the future China? And what is it that we're going to have to do here in Mexico to really take advantage of that chapter?
Basically, what I will tell you is that one of the advantages of negotiating a deal in a plurilateral basis is that it helps you to do a balanced package in different sectors that are very sensitive. One of them, the agricultural sector or agro-industries. The same sector will be very defensive against the capacities of New Zealand on milk, but at the same time will be very aggressive on selling things to Vietnam, selling things to Japan. So that helped a lot in order to really construct balanced deals. In the case of the textile sector, which is one of the very sensitive sectors, we had a specific issue with Vietnam. So building up the state enterprise charter was a way to really make sure that the influence of the state companies in Vietnam for textiles, shoes, apparel, were in a way monitored and observed in terms that will not represent a very unloyal advantage in terms of international trade. But at the same time, it was a very complex negotiation, and I have to admit it, because it was plurilateral, and we will do bilateral agreements within the 12 nations. But at the same time, Malaysia and Vietnam were economies that had never been open. And for them to jump in a set of disciplines that for us, we had had for a 20-year experience in doing them, was a very tough and difficult negotiation. And what was more difficult for us is to be observing the kind of deals Mike was going to offer to the Vietnamese. Because it's not about just watching the Mexican domestic market for textiles, but also looking into how splendid Mike was with some of these countries in terms of because at the end of the day, we were monitoring also our access to the US market. So at the end of the process, one of the difficult things was a deal that the US had already used with Central America, and was one of the elements that make the sector a little bit uncomfortable. But when you analyze the details of that deal, it's subject to the consumption of US cotton, is 1-to-1, and therefore by itself has a limit. The US cotton production is not very abundant. And when you look at the expertise of the Central Americans dealing with that agreement, it is not an open-ended benefit. And therefore, my discussion with the textile sector was obviously, we negotiated, we moderated the level of ambition, and at the end of the day, we tried to craft something that we can live with. But it's very difficult because you are not negotiating something bilaterally. You are telling one country, wait, because in the middle of your negotiation, you are taking my interests along the way. And so those are the difficult areas that we have to craft at the end of the deal. And you have to put in a balance all the good things you have done, and at the same time, what are those few things that are a little bit of a trouble. And one of the main elements after the negotiation was concluded is that when you review public opinion and the expression in media, there are basically very few sectors that did not feel included in the consensus that we built before every negotiation that we close.
Very good. So the same question about tough moments and tough issues. I remember being in a little tour around the world with the WTO, and I was in Surabaya, and I was not a part of the negotiation, the last stage for Japan to enter. But I remember there was a lot of heat and sometimes a lot of fire. So what can you tell us about your negotiation with Japan?
Not much. No, look, I think as Ildefonso pointed out, this was an incredibly complicated negotiation because you had a dozen countries, developed, emerging, developing, some of whom, like Chile, had FTAs with all of the countries already, of varying quality, but they had FTAs with all the countries. And so the tools that you use of offering market access in order to get agreement on rules or things of that sort were much more difficult to apply here. And this was not a case where 8 of the countries basically agreed on everything, and it was just an issue of bringing the other 4 countries over the line. On every single issue, I mean, correct me if you think differently, Alfonso, on almost every single issue, it was a different coalition of countries, some of whom were in favor, some of whom were against, some of whom had very different ideas, and you had to build a consensus issue by issue, and then at the end of the day, everyone had to take a step back, as Ildefonso said, and said, is this a balanced package? And do my offensive and defensive interests, have they fallen in such a way that I can defend this at home and meet the expectations of the political system and our stakeholders? And it's one reason it took 5 years to negotiate, of hard negotiation, because it was so complicated across so many issues, including new issues like state-owned enterprises or the digital economy that all of us were working on together to help define rules that had not been defined before. And so, again, I think I'm immensely, I have a huge respect for all of the ministers and the chief negotiators and their teams for having worked through these issues one by one, at the end of the day, to produce an agreement that I think all of us, and this is true in the US too, we're very pleased that our textile industry, this is the first time that they've been an all-out supporter of a trade agreement, as well as our apparel importers, our footwear producers, as well as our footwear importers, virtually all of our agriculture industry. And we all, I think, tried very hard to meet the needs of the widest possible group of stakeholders that we could, so that this would be a win-win for everybody.
So I should understand that the negotiation with Japan was not difficult.
The negotiation with Japan was difficult. Negotiation with Mexico was difficult. Negotiation with all the countries. I think they would all agree that negotiation with the United States was difficult. So we are self-aware.
We helped it a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to leave time for some questions. Sure. This is, as you may imagine, everybody in Mexico and the world is looking at the approval of TPP in the US. If the US does not approve TPP, TPP will not exist because there's this restriction of 85% of GDP has to approve before TPP comes alive. So we would like to ask you, what are the perspectives for approval, and even more important, what would happen if TPP is not approved in the lame duck session, and what will happen if TPP is not approved, period? And here I'm thinking about China. China has an agreement that is progressing with ASEAN, and obviously it would be a big drama if the US does not approve TPP. What can you tell us about it?
Well, first of all, we are fully committed to doing everything we can to get it approved this year. You've heard you've heard President Obama reiterate this as recently as last week when he was in Asia. We have a whole of government, whole of White House effort underway to address issues that Congress has raised, to build support among rank and file members of Congress, and I believe those processes are progressing well. I agree with the notion underlying your question. We think it's absolutely critical that it get approved, both for economic reasons and for strategic reasons. We made clear, and it's clear from all the legitimate independent studies of the agreement, how much it contributes to the U.S. GDP, to U.S. exports, to wages. 2/3 of the benefits of the agreement go to workers, both skilled workers and unskilled workers, according to the independent analysis. It benefits manufacturing, services, agriculture, the high-tech community, really across the board. And as you note, one of the key reasons to get it done is that the rest of the world is not standing still. China, as you said, is negotiating something called RCEP. It's got 16 countries, ranging from India to Japan. And unlike TPP, it doesn't have labor and environmental obligations. It doesn't maintain a free and open internet. It doesn't impose disciplines on how state-owned enterprises operate. And it doesn't strengthen intellectual property rights enforcement. And if it moves forward and TPP doesn't, from a US perspective, it means, first of all, we'll be cut out of markets, squeezed out of markets that are some of the most important future markets for our exports. And secondly, we'll be operating in a system where the rules of the road don't reflect the high standards we've negotiated in TPP, but reflect a very different set of standards that don't play to our interests or our values, and that's why it's so important to bring forward. We've heard a number of Asian leaders, whether it's Prime Minister Lee, when he was in Washington most recently in August, or Prime Minister Key of New Zealand, or Prime Minister Abe, talk about how important TPP is strategically to the US position in the Asia Pacific as a Pacific power, to our alliances and our partnerships in the region, and how failure to move ahead with TPP would undermine our credibility and our leadership in the region and effectively hand the keys of the castle, as we say, over to China. At the end of the day, I think that's why I am optimistic that it will ultimately get approved, because I don't think Congress ultimately wants to turn the keys of the castle to this vitally important region over to China. It wants to make sure the US continues to play a leadership role in this region and in the global economy more generally.
It was said before by Jaime Zabludowski at the opening speech that it would be not only that, but it would be a terrible message for the world.
Yep.
That one of the other two leaders in pro-free trade and establishing a rules-based system, the UK and the US, if both of you guys go into the negative side, the message for the world will be terrible.
Let me take it from there, because Mike and I coincided in the Hangzhou meetings. He was with President Obama doing a regional tour, and I was with President Peña at the G20. And one of the very strong messages from the leadership is that after the financial crisis that created G20, growth has been, on average, around 3.4, not able to recuperate the levels of growth of almost 5% on the past 5 years before the crisis. And if you look at the growth of trade, has been decreasing on an average in the last 3 years by 16%. So there is definitely a very worried view of leaders in how free trade is losing grounds as a motor for growth. And one of the elements that has been the common denominator of the discussion is that the leadership in the world has not been able to really make sure that society and citizens really are included in the benefits of free trade and understands the benefits of free trade. And that is part of what we are looking in the debates in parts of the world. Now, the billion is not free trade. The billion is modernization, Industrial Revolution 4.0, robotization. But somehow trade deals have to have that view. What are you doing with your microphone there, man?
Just playing.
So the point is that TPP, just as Mike was making a case, being a 21st generation agreement, is responding to some of these elements. The fact that it has an SMEs charter, the way to really get involved, as Senator Mario Delgado and some other senators made a reference in terms of how can we make sure that national value content is really expanding in the value chains that we export around the world, how our industrial policies make it easier for SMEs to participate in the production process, and how to spread evenly the benefits of free trade. So it's one of the elements that is behind this global discussion. And we had a meeting with the Prime Minister of England, and I like her approach. I mean, within what we lost because of Brexit, at least the view of the new leadership in England is very clear. She said, we did not leave Europe. We are just leaving the European Union, which means England will be still a force for free trade, for open markets, for free markets. So the ideological view and the commitment to be a force in world trade is still there. So what we did in this conversation with Theresa May is say, here is the draft for the bilateral UK-Mexico. As soon as you are ready, we are ready. So in a way, I think that we are in a high-risk point to really make sure that these initiatives prosper. And just responding the question that you asked to Mike, and did not ask to me, but I do agree with some of the senators that Mexico has to have a strong signal that we are going to have TPP approved regardless of what happened in the US in November, and regardless who becomes the next president of the United States. We have to be ready to make our next move and send a signal to the world that Mexico believes that we have been growing to free trade policies and will be committed with them.
Very good. Well, there is the only question that is addressed directly to you, even in English, are things that you already did perfectly well, so there's no need. This is done by a US, I think it's a US citizen that works here, but everything, so why is the interest of US in negotiating TPP? Is it geopolitical, blah, blah, blah. So, no, you answer all. It's a good question, but you answer all.
Probably one of your assistants was late in asking the question.
And then there's a series of 4 questions that are basically the same for Secretary Guajardo with respect to what are you going to do with respect to small and medium-sized companies? How are you going to increase the competitiveness of Mexico to face the challenges and for those sectors where the most vulnerable sectors, what are you going to do about that?
Basically, it is clear. I always say that when we did NAFTA, it was a great agreement that has definitely changed not only the economy of Mexico, but its economic geography in terms of how we developed the northern region, the central regions. But at the same time, there was homework that was not done at the time. We went into NAFTA with a concentrated and insufficient energy markets, highly priced energy for the private sector. We went into NAFTA with unregulated financial markets, where SMEs had to pay much more for interest rates that big companies had to pay. We went into NAFTA with very rigid labor markets. We went into NAFTA with highly concentrated market for strategic inputs, like telecommunications. And so, even with that, NAFTA wrote a success story. But obviously, the potential of NAFTA was not exploited because we were not able to instrument the economic reforms that we needed. 20 years later, thanks to the consensus of the political parties, we were able to do those reforms. And what those reforms mean is to level the playing field for SMEs. To tell a supplier of the auto industry that he can have or aspire to have the same electrical industrial rates than the guy that is across the border in Texas. To tell that guy that he will not have to pay for in technologies of information or telecommunication 40% more than his competitors pay in Europe. So leveling the playing field with economic reforms is going to make TPP much more effective than what we did with NAFTA. A simple example, petrochemicals. We did NAFTA, but guess what? Gas was not privately produced, and in order to really make petrochemicals grow, we were depending on the availability of gas and the competitiveness of gas. What happened is that the country was growing, and our deficit of petrochemicals was 75% of the domestic demand. Now, with the energy reform and with the infrastructure for gas lines in the country, petrochemicals will have a chance under TPP that did not have under NAFTA. So at the end of the day, making the economy more efficient and really supporting the SME's contribution to the value chain through process in which you really get them access to essential inputs, it will make a difference between who is getting benefit of the new initiative.
Well, the dynamics.
Can I just build on that for one
Please.
moment on SMEs and make a slightly broader point? I think one of the key elements of TPP is its focus on SMEs and the opportunity that it opens for SMEs. And we already see that in our bilateral trade. We have over 50,000 SMEs in the US that export to Mexico. 33,000 of them are actually micro enterprises with fewer than 20 employees. And those 33,000 firms export about $38 billion to Mexico. And that's a tribute to our Mexican American and Hispanic communities in the US and their entrepreneurship and their ability to develop networks in Mexico and across Latin America to sell product from the US here. We see this as a great opportunity, and we look with great interest, of course, as Mexico and develops further the Pacific Alliance and the opportunities that creates for further integration in Latin America and our ability to send product from the US through Latin America because of our strong Hispanic community in the United States. Looking more broadly, when you get rid of red tape at the borders, when you harmonize customs and trade facilitation procedures, when you strengthen the e-commerce environment, all of these go to making it easier for SMEs to participate in global trade, and that's, I think, one of the key positive elements of TPP for all the countries.
Certainly, the dynamics of the negotiation of NAFTA and this one were very different in two minor sectors, energy and telecom. In energy and telecom, in NAFTA, we just say no, 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 no. And here, basically, you didn't have to discuss it because given the leadership of President Peña Nieto and the understanding and the approval of our Congress, those reforms were already there. So
Yeah, you say during NAFTA, no, 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 but you left the key to open it. Because during the grandfathering clause that you included in NAFTA, any unilateral opening that a country do, it will be immediately captured by the agreement. So with or without TPP, NAFTA will have incorporated the energy reform.
Sure, that's very clear. This is something that you already spoke, but I guess the simple fact that somebody's asking it again, given the importance, somebody's asking what is the meaning and what are the benefits of the coexistence of TPP and NAFTA?
It was one of the elements that was extremely relevant for us and obviously for the private sector. As a matter of fact, our negotiating paragraph was worked hand by hand with the advisory group from the private sector. The idea at the bottom is anybody playing in the North American field will be able to use for market access, rules of origin. If you are trading within North America, you can use NAFTA, or you can use TPP. But understanding, obviously, that any new item that is introduced by the new agreement, it will be overimposed over the old agreement. So coexistence is just sending clear signals to the private businessman or the economic entity to have clarity on which environment to work.
Well, unless you want to say something, I would like to express, again, my appreciation and recognition to you and President Obama. Wish you very good luck for you, for the US, Mexico, and the rest of the world immediately, during the election and immediately after the election. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You must agree that we have two great leaders.
Thank you so much for your presence. Gracias, Secretario Guajardo. Gracias, Embajador Froman. Gracias, Doctor Blanco. Les vamos a hacer entrega de unos reconocimientos. Y les pedimos que se queden a la foto, por favor.
Buenas tardes. Antes de que se vayan, bueno, antes que se vayan, déjenos despedirlos, ¿no? Por favor. Nada más unas palabras de agradecimiento a todos ustedes, en particular a nuestros invitados que vinieron desde fuera y por supuesto a Juan Pablo Castañón y todo el liderazgo empresarial, a los senadores de la República que nos acompañaron, a nuestros moderadores y amigos y sobre todo al personal de Comex. Y este es un esfuerzo más que hacemos por darle seguimiento a los temas que son relevantes para México. Muchas gracias.